It was a cold, foggy night in Queens, New York. The kind of night where the mist clings to your skin and every breath feels heavy in your chest. The city around me was quiet, almost too quiet for a place as bustling as New York. I had just gotten off work, and all I could think about was getting home, throwing on my pajamas, and falling into bed. My body ached. My eyes were sore from staring at screens all day, and my mind was racing with the stress of the job. I needed rest, badly. As I stood waiting for the bus, I remembered a shortcut I could take. It was a route I had passed by 100 times, but never thought much of. The old butcher's alley. People in the neighborhood whispered about it, mostly in jest. It was just a narrow alley, wedged between two old buildings with peeling paint and flickering lights. But there was something about it that always made me uneasy. Perhaps it was the fact that it was tucked away from the main roads, the shadows that seemed to swallow the path, or the way the dim lights never quite reached the far end. It had the kind of vibe that made you want to walk faster when you were near it, but also the kind of place that drew you in out of curiosity, like a moth to a flame. I sighed. The bus stop was taking forever, and I was already late. Why not? I thought. A little walk wouldn't hurt. The alley was just a few blocks away, and it would cut my commute down by at least 10 minutes. Besides, it was late, and most of the shops nearby were closed. There was no one around to bother me. I turned onto the side street where the alley was located, the street lights flickering intermittently. The air had a chill to it, and the damp fog seemed to cling to everything. The buildings on either side of the alley were old, with faded neon signs that struggled to stay lit. They buzzed faintly, like ghosts trying to keep their light alive. The shops along this stretch had been here forever, their owners long gone, replaced by new tenants who rarely lasted. I took a deep breath and stepped into the alley. The smell hit me first. It was a mix of damp wood and the lingering scent of meat, almost sickly sweet. The kind of smell that made your stomach churn if you thought about it too much. I wasn't sure why it smelled like that. There hadn't been a butcher shop here for years, but the scent seemed to seep into the walls and linger, like a memory that refused to fade. I walked slowly, my shoes clicking against the wet pavement, the sound echoing in the empty space. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. It was almost claustrophobic, the walls of the buildings so close you could reach out and touch them. The fog curled around my feet, making everything seem unreal, like I was walking through some kind of dream. As I walked deeper into the alley, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. Normally, even at this hour, you'd hear the distant hum of traffic or the occasional person passing by. But here, there was only the sound of my own footsteps. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, like someone was watching me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the late hour, the isolation of the alley. It was easy to feel on edge when you were alone in a place like this. I glanced around, trying to distract myself from the strange feeling creeping over me. The alley was still. The few windows on the buildings were dark, their curtains drawn. There were no signs of life, no sounds of movement. It was like the entire block was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me until it was almost too much to bear. I quickened my pace, eager to get to the end of the alley and out into the light. The flickering neon signs seemed to grow dimmer the further I walked, as if they were fading away with each step. My footsteps echoed louder now, the sound filling the empty space. It felt like I was the only person in the world. But just as I was about to reach the end of the alley, something stopped me in my tracks. I heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, so soft that I almost thought I imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, almost like a voice calling my name. It was a soft, raspy voice, the kind of whisper you might hear in your dreams, or maybe in your nightmares. It sent a cold chill down my spine. I stopped and turned around, scanning the alley for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The alley was empty, the same as it had been when I first entered. I couldn't explain it. The hair on my neck stood up, and I felt a shiver run down my back. "It's just the wind," I muttered to myself, trying to calm my nerves. I wasn't the superstitious type, but there was something about this place, this alley, that made me feel like I wasn't alone. I took a few cautious steps back, scanning the shadows for any sign of life. But there was nothing. No one. I started walking faster, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. My footsteps quickened as I neared the end of the alley, but the whisper seemed to follow me. It was getting louder now, almost insistent, as if it was trying to pull me back into the darkness. "Come closer," the voice seemed to say. "Come closer." My heart pounded in my chest. I broke into a run, my shoes slipping slightly on the wet pavement. I didn't dare look back. All I wanted was to get out of there, to be anywhere but in that alley. The sound of my own breathing seemed deafening, but the whisper still lingered in my ears, like it was following me. I finally reached the end of the alley and stumbled into the street, gasping for breath. The sounds of the city greeted me. Cars passing by. The faint hum of life. But the eerie feeling from the alley stayed with me. I glanced behind me one last time, but the alley was empty, just as it always had been. But something was different. The air felt heavier now, like the alley had left its mark on me. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I'd walked through that alley 100 times before, never giving it a second thought. But tonight was different. The whisper, the voice that had called my name, wouldn't leave me. And I knew that the butcher's alley held more than just a strange smell and forgotten neon lights. It held something far darker, something that wasn't ready to be forgotten. I never walked that alley again, and I wouldn't recommend you do it either. The next day, the sun came up sluggishly over the skyline of Queens. The fog from the previous night had lifted, but it still felt like there was a heaviness in the air, as though the city hadn't fully shaken off the strange feeling I'd been left with after my walk through the butcher's alley. The encounter with the whisper, the voice that called my name, everything felt like it had happened to someone else. But the unease lingered in the pit of my stomach, and it wasn't until I ran into an old friend at the diner that it all came rushing back. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the hustle and bustle of the city hadn't yet kicked into full gear. I was sitting at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to shake off the fog in my own head. The clink of plates and cups, the hum of the old jukebox in the corner, and the low murmur of conversations from the other patrons filled the air. It was comforting, familiar, exactly what I needed after the long night. Then I heard a voice behind me. "Well, well, look who it is," the voice said, smooth and gravelly, just like I remembered. I turned around, and there he was, Tommy. He was a local, always hanging around the neighborhood, one of those guys who knew everyone and everything. You could always find him at the diner or on the corner, leaning against the lamppost, cracking jokes or telling old stories. He wasn't a bad guy, but there was always something a little too unpredictable about him. The kind of guy who could start a conversation about the weather and somehow end up talking about the end of the world. "Hey, Tommy," I said, smiling a little. "You still hanging around here?" "Where else would I be?" he chuckled, sitting down next to me at the counter. The waitress, who knew Tommy well, brought him his usual black coffee with a side of pie. "So, what's been going on? You still working that boring office job?" he asked, making a face as if the idea of sitting at a desk all day was the worst thing in the world. "Yeah, same old," I replied, sipping my coffee. "Can't complain though, it pays the bills." "Yeah, well, bills are overrated," Tommy said with a grin. Taking a bite of his pie, we chatted for a while, catching up on the usual stuff. Who was still living in the neighborhood? What had changed? And the little gossip that always seemed to find its way to the diner's walls. Then, as the conversation settled into a lull, Tommy suddenly leaned in closer, lowering his voice. It was subtle, but there was a shift in his demeanor. Something that told me he wasn't just making casual small talk anymore. He looked around, almost as if he was making sure no one was listening. And then he said, "You know about the butcher's alley, right?" I froze, my hand halfway to my cup. The butcher's alley. I'd heard of it, of course. Everyone had, but I hadn't really thought much about it since the night before. It was one of those things you knew existed, but you never gave it any more thought. But now, hearing Tommy mention it like that, so casually, yet with a hint of seriousness, it sent a cold shiver down my spine. "Yeah, I know about it," I said, trying to sound nonchalant, even though I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "But I don't really know much about it. Just the usual stories, I guess." Tommy's eyes flickered, and he leaned in even closer, as if he was about to share a secret that no one else in the diner should hear. "Well, it's not as harmless as you think," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "They say there's a killer who roams those streets late at night. They call him the Meat Hook Killer." I couldn't help but laugh, trying to shake off the sudden unease that had washed over me. The meat hook killer sounds like something out of a bad slasher movie. But Tommy didn't laugh. Instead, his face hardened, his eyes narrowing in a way I'd never seen before. Some say he's a butcher who went mad, he continued, his voice barely audible now. But other people say he's something worse, something that shouldn't even be walking around at all. I leaned back slightly, the laughter fading from my face. Tommy wasn't joking. The look in his eyes, the seriousness in his voice. It was clear that this wasn't just some wild tale he was spinning. He believed it. And that, more than anything else, made the whole thing feel real. More real than I wanted it to be. Okay, hold on, I said, trying to make sense of what he was saying. So you're telling me there's some guy running around with a meat hook, killing people, in that alley? Tommy shrugged, his fingers tapping nervously on the counter. That's what they say. People go missing all the time around there. Some of them just disappear, and others are found with hooks in their bodies. And not just any hooks. These things are huge. The kind you use to hang carcasses. They say it's his calling card. A signature, you know? I could feel my skin grow cold. I knew the butcher's alley had a history, but this was different. This wasn't just a place with a creepy vibe or a reputation for being a little too quiet. This was something much darker. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. You're serious, right? I asked, my voice a little shakier than I intended. You really think someone's out there doing this? Tommy nodded slowly. I've heard the stories, man. Everyone has. People say you can hear the sounds of the hook scraping against the pavement when he's close. And you know what else? They say he only comes out after midnight. That's when he gets his victims. If you're walking alone near that alley after dark, well, you might just be the next one. I tried to brush it off, but the images started to creep into my mind. The alley at night, dark and empty, with only the sound of the hook dragging across the ground. The thought of someone or something lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next victim. Look, Tommy said, noticing the hesitation in my face. I'm just telling you what I know. I've been around this neighborhood long enough to hear the whispers, and you don't want to find out what's true and what's not by being the next victim. I'll keep that in mind, I finally said, trying to sound casual. But inside, I was anything but calm. I was rattled. Tommy gave me a pointed look, his eyes locking with mine. Trust me, man, he said, lowering his voice even further. Don't walk alone near that alley after midnight. You'll be begging for your life. I wasn't sure if it was the tone in his voice or the weight of his words, but I knew he wasn't kidding. Something about the way he said it, so matter-of-factly, made me believe him, and just like that, a seed of doubt was planted in my mind. From that moment on, I couldn't look at the butcher's alley the same way again. I finished my coffee in silence. The unease. Later that week, I found myself in the same alley again. I didn't plan on it. I didn't even want to be there. But something pulled me back. The moment I stepped into the alley, I immediately felt the weight of the air. It was heavier tonight, thicker, like it was pressing down on me. The dim lights flickered even more erratically, and the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch further, almost as though they were alive. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I'd been through this alley dozens of times before, never giving it a second thought. But tonight was different. Something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was following me. The thought of turning back crossed my mind, but I stubbornly ignored it, my legs carrying me deeper into the alley, despite the unease tightening in my chest. The farther I walked, the more the sensation of being watched crept over me. It wasn't just paranoia. I could feel it. My footsteps echoed off the walls, and the alley seemed to stretch out in front of me, a tunnel of darkness. The occasional gust of wind made the streetlights above sway, but everything around me remained unnaturally quiet. Then it happened. That unmistakable sound. The soft, rhythmic tapping of footsteps behind me, following me, growing closer with every passing second. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't imagining it. Someone, or something, was behind me. I spun around in a panic, but there was nothing. Just the alley, empty. The faint glow of the streetlights shone weakly on the wet pavement, casting long, twisted shadows. I quickly glanced down the alley. Still nothing. No one. Just the eerie silence that seemed to consume everything. I stood there for a few moments, trying to gather my thoughts, trying to calm myself. I could feel my breath coming faster, more shallow. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself. "It's just the wind, just the city. Calm down." But as soon as I turned to continue walking, I heard it again. The footsteps. Louder this time, closer. They were coming from behind me, and they weren't stopping. My body tensed, and I instinctively quickened my pace, my heart pounding louder in my chest. I didn't know if I should turn around or keep moving forward, but the feeling of being followed was too overwhelming. It was like someone was right there, just a few steps behind me, but I couldn't see them. I forced myself to walk faster, trying to get out of that alley as quickly as I could. The farther I went, the more the feeling of being watched intensified, as though the shadows themselves were pressing in on me. I couldn't breathe properly. My chest felt tight, and the air felt colder by the second. I dared to glance over my shoulder once more. That's when I saw it. At the end of the alley, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, its features obscured by the shadows. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, standing in the distance, like it had been waiting for me. I froze. My legs felt like they were made of stone, rooted to the spot, unable to move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. I watched as it slowly stepped forward, its movements deliberate and unnervingly calm. It was wearing a long coat, its edges flapping in the wind as it moved closer. I could feel my pulse racing in my ears. With every step it took, I could feel the tension building in my chest, tightening my throat. What was it? Who was it? As the figure drew closer, I could make out more details. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Its coat looked old, worn, like something out of another time. But it wasn't the coat that made my blood run cold. It was what the figure was holding in its hand. A massive meat hook. It glinted in the faint moonlight, the sharp metal gleaming like a promise of violence. I could see the hook clearly now, and the sheer size of it made my stomach lurch. It was no ordinary hook. This thing was made for hanging carcasses, for pulling the weight of something far heavier than a human body. My mind tried to reject the sight, but I couldn't look away. My legs were frozen, and my feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. The figure didn't say a word. It just stood there, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck. The world seemed to shrink around me, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. And then, without warning, it lunged. It wasn't a fast motion, but it was sudden, like it had been waiting for the exact moment to strike. The hook swung through the air with a sickening screech, the sound of metal slicing through the night. I didn't even think. My body reacted instinctively. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and in that moment, panic took over. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. My legs moved faster than they ever had before, pumping furiously as I scrambled through the alley. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and my chest burned with every step. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't look behind me to see if it was still following. The only thing that mattered was getting out of that alley, out of that place of pure, unexplainable terror. The alley seemed to stretch on forever, the end just beyond reach. I felt like I was running through a nightmare, my feet barely touching the ground as I ran, the cold air stinging my face. I could feel the figure closing in behind me, the heavy sound of footsteps matching my own, like it was right on my heels. I reached the end of the alley and burst into the street, my heart hammering in my chest, my legs shaking with exhaustion. The sound of my feet pounding on the pavement was drowned out by the rush of adrenaline still surging through my body. I didn't stop running until I reached the well-lit street, the noise of the city slowly pulling me back to reality. I glanced behind me, still trying to catch my breath, and saw nothing. The alley was empty, quiet, normal. But I knew what I had seen. The meat hook, the figure. I hadn't imagined it. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was real. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to. All I knew was that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I had ever imagined. And I would never, ever walk near that alley again. I didn't know how, but I somehow managed to break free. My legs were like lead, heavy and uncooperative, but my instinct to survive kicked in with a force I couldn't explain. My heart was pounding so loudly it felt like it was going to burst out of my chest, each beat thundering in my ears. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every step I took felt like the ground beneath me was sinking, like it wanted to swallow me whole. But I didn't stop. The only thing that mattered in that moment was the need to escape, to get out of that alley, away from whatever that thing was. The sound of my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud as they echoed off the walls, reverberating in the narrow space. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my lungs on fire as I pushed myself faster. The alley seemed endless, stretching on and on, its walls closing in around me, the darkness pressing like a suffocating weight. The air felt thick, heavy, like I was running through a fog that wouldn't lift. But I didn't care about the air or the walls anymore. I just needed to keep moving. I could feel the cold creeping up my spine, the sensation of being chased, of being pursued by something far worse than a mere human. I could still hear it, the dragging of the meat hook on the pavement, the quiet, deliberate footfalls that seemed to follow me even as I ran. My mind screamed at me to run faster, to keep going, but my legs were starting to give out. The terror was overwhelming, and every part of me wanted to collapse, to give up, to curl into a ball and beg for mercy. But I couldn't, not yet. And then, finally, I saw it. The end of the alley. The light from the street beyond beckoned me like a lifeline. I pushed myself harder, my body screaming in protest, but I didn't care. I could taste the air outside the alley, the freedom that came with reaching the end. I wasn't thinking about what was behind me, what was chasing me. I was thinking about getting out. My eyes were locked on the light, on the safety just beyond the darkness. With one last burst of energy, I made it. I stumbled out of the alley and into the open street, my feet barely touching the ground as I fell into the light. The change in atmosphere was immediate. The air felt fresher, the weight on my shoulders lifted. I could see the city around me, hear the sounds of traffic, the hum of life that seemed so distant just moments ago. It was like stepping into another world, one that didn't know the horrors of the butcher's alley. I didn't stop running. I kept going, not even bothering to look around, not daring to slow down. The adrenaline was still coursing through my veins, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the thing from the alley was still there, lurking just beyond my reach. My body was shaking uncontrollably, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my back, my face pale from fear and exhaustion. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath, but I didn't stop, not until I was a few blocks away, my heart still racing in my chest. I finally slowed down, my legs threatening to buckle beneath me. I looked around, my eyes darting from side to side, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I was out of the alley, but the fear was still gripping me, tightening around my chest like a vice. My body was trembling, and it wasn't just from the physical exertion. It was the aftershock of the terror, the realization of what I had just experienced. I didn't know who or what that thing was, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to get away from it. I took a few shaky steps, trying to calm my breathing, but I couldn't shake the image of the figure from the alley. The hook. The way it gleamed in the moonlight. The way it had lunged at me with such chilling precision. I could still hear the screech of the metal as it sliced through the air. My skin crawled at the memory. The figure had been tall, unnaturally tall. Its coat had been dark, old, like it belonged to someone long dead. But it wasn't the coat that haunted me. It was the way it had stood there, motionless, waiting for me to come closer. It hadn't said a word, hadn't made a sound. It had just stared at me, the gleaming meat hook in its hand, like it was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then, when it had lunged, it had moved with a speed and precision that defied logic. Like it had been prepared for this moment, like it had been waiting for me. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to explain it. The more I thought about it, the more the fear gripped me, twisting in my stomach. It wasn't a human. It couldn't have been. It moved too smoothly, too deliberately, and the way it had disappeared without a trace when I reached the street, it didn't make sense. I glanced over my shoulder once, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I half expected to see it standing there at the end of the street, waiting for me to make a mistake, to turn back. But there was nothing. The street was empty. The buildings lined up like silent sentinels. The lights were bright, the sounds of the city filling the air. I was safe, or so it seemed. But deep down, I knew that I wasn't. I could still feel the weight of that figure's presence, still hear the dragging of the meat hook in my mind, echoing in my ears. It wasn't over. I could still feel it, creeping up on me, just out of sight. The fear had settled in, deep in my bones. It was like a shadow that refused to leave me. I stood there for a few moments, trying to get my bearings, trying to calm my nerves, but it was no use. The fear was too strong, the memories too fresh. I couldn't stay in the city, not like this. I needed to get home. I needed to find some sense of normalcy again, to get away from the nightmare I had just narrowly escaped. But even as I walked away from the alley, even as I put more distance between myself and the terror that had nearly consumed me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That thing with the hook, it wasn't just some figment of my imagination. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was real, and it was out there, waiting. And I knew one thing for sure. I was never, ever going near that butcher's alley again. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop wondering, what if it wasn't just the alley? What if it was following me, waiting for the next time I made a mistake? I didn't have the answers, and I didn't want to find out. All I knew was that I had escaped, and I would never take the chance again. The next few days after the horrifying encounter with the figure in the butcher's alley, I couldn't shake the image of the meat hook killer out of my head. No matter where I went, what I did, or who I talked to, his image loomed over me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a freak occurrence, a trick of the mind, a product of fear and exhaustion. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the gleam of that giant meat hook, the figure's hollow eyes locked on me, and the screech of metal dragging against the pavement. I couldn't get away from it. I tried to talk to a few locals, hoping to put my mind at ease. After all, I wasn't the only one who had seen the alley before, walked through it without incident. But as I expected, when I brought up the meat hook killer, most people just brushed me off. They laughed, said it was nothing more than an old urban legend, a tale passed down over the years to scare kids into staying away from the alley after dark. That stuff's been around for ages, one man said, his voice filled with disbelief. Don't let a couple of strange things you saw mess with your head. But it wasn't just a couple of strange things. What I had seen, what I had felt, was beyond explanation. I wasn't crazy. I knew what I had experienced. And though the others didn't seem to care, I needed to know more. It wasn't until I visited the bar down the street, an old haunt where locals gathered to drink, laugh, and talk about life, that I found someone who might understand. The bar had that old familiar charm, dim lighting, a jukebox in the corner, and a few regulars sitting at the bar exchanging stories. The place smelled of wood and whiskey, a bit of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. I walked in, ordered a drink, and tried to ignore the nagging feeling that the meat hook killer was still following me. I sat at the far end of the bar, hoping for some distraction, anything to take my mind off the terror I'd experienced. It was then that I noticed the old man sitting alone at the end of the bar. He was hunched over, a dark hat pulled low over his eyes. His weathered face told stories, his wrinkles deep and telling of years lived in this very neighborhood. He had a quiet presence about him, but there was something in the way he observed the room that made me uneasy, as if he knew everything and had seen it all. As I turned away from him, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. The bartender, a man in his late 40s with a thick accent, called me over. I walked over to him, trying to focus on the moment and ignore the creeping sense of dread. "Hey kid," the old man's voice cracked, drawing my attention. I turned to see his piercing eyes fixed on me, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "You've seen him, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low, a mixture of curiosity and something darker. His eyes weren't the bright, curious eyes of someone asking a question. They were calculating, like he already knew the answer. "Who?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My heart skipped a beat. I already knew where this was going. "The meat hook killer," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've seen him, haven't you?" I froze. It felt like the entire room went silent, like everything around me was shutting down, focusing only on the old man's words. I nodded slowly, unsure of what else to say. My mouth went dry, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't a joke. He knew something. The old man didn't wait for me to respond. He just continued, his voice lowering even further, so quiet I had to lean in to hear him. "He was once a butcher," the man began, his voice almost mournful. "A long time ago, back when this neighborhood was still a real community before the big businesses came in and changed everything. He worked at one of the oldest butcher shops in Queens. His name was George, or at least that's what they said. He paused, staring into his empty glass. The silence stretched between us, thick with anticipation. Something happened to him, he continued, his voice almost a whisper now. Something dark. Some say he lost his mind. He started using his meat hooks for more than just cutting up meat. They say he started using them on anyone who walked down the alley. People went missing. Some people said they saw him, his coat dark as night, standing at the end of the alley, waiting for someone to get too close. But nobody did anything. Nobody wanted to say anything. People were afraid. I shifted uncomfortably on the stool. It felt like the weight of the old man's words was sinking in, settling on my shoulders like an iron weight. My mind raced. George, the butcher, the meat hook killer. It all started to come together. But the more I learned, the more confused I became. If this man was real, if what the old man said was true, why hadn't I heard more about it? Why hadn't I seen anything about it in the news? He was caught once, the old man said, as though reading my thoughts. They caught him, but no one really knows what happened after that. Some say they locked him up, but the story stopped. Others say they never really found him, and maybe, just maybe, he's still out there, walking the streets, waiting for the next victim. The man took a long sip of his drink, his hand trembling slightly as he lowered it back onto the bar. I swallowed hard. The idea of this butcher, this figure, stalking the alleys, waiting for his next victim, sent a shiver down my spine. But it wasn't just the idea of him that scared me. It was the fact that the old man's words didn't sound like the usual stories people told to scare others. This man spoke with a quiet certainty, as though he had lived through it all. He wasn't just telling a tale. He was sharing a truth. And some, he said, looking me dead in the eyes, some say he's not human anymore, that he's just a shadow that walks the alley at night, that after all these years, after all the souls he took, he's become something else, something that can't be stopped. I didn't know what to say. The room around us seemed to fade into the background, and for a moment, I felt like I was the only one in the world. I wasn't sure what the old man had seen, what he knew, but I could tell he wasn't the type to make up stories. He believed what he was telling me, and what's more, I believed him too. A chill ran down my spine. "Be careful, kid," he muttered as I stood to leave. "Stay out of the alley. Don't go back. Not after dark. Trust me, you don't want to see what's really out there." I nodded slowly, unsure if I was still hearing the man clearly, or if his words had sunk in too deeply to be processed right away. As I left the bar, the heavy weight of his warning stayed with me. I had already felt the presence of the figure in the alley, but now it was like the veil had been lifted, and I could see the truth behind the myth. The meat hook killer wasn't just a story. He wasn't some tall tale to scare the kids away. He was real, and he was out there, waiting. The story of the meat hook killer haunted me for weeks. I couldn't escape it. Every night, I would close my eyes, and there it was, the image of that tall, dark figure standing at the end of the alley, the gleam of the meat hook flashing under the pale light of the street lamps. The sound of his footsteps echoed in my ears. Even when I tried to distract myself, the memory would slip in, uninvited, creeping through my thoughts like a shadow. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just behind me, never fully went away. I tried to convince myself that it was just a story, a tall tale meant to scare people into staying away from the alley. After all, I had been through the alley many times before, never once thinking much of it. But now, everything had changed. I couldn't stop feeling like there was something more to it, something sinister that I hadn't fully understood until now. There was no logical explanation for it, but I couldn't ignore the warning. The old man's words echoed in my mind, and despite myself, I found myself staying away from the alley, walking around it if I ever had to pass through the neighborhood at night. I kept reminding myself that I wasn't the superstitious type. I didn't believe in ghosts, and I didn't believe in legends either. But this wasn't just a story told around a campfire. This felt real, too real, and every time I walked through the streets of Queens, every time I passed near that alley, my mind would inevitably wander back to that night, back to the figure with the meat hook and the feeling of pure terror that had coursed through me. For a while, I thought about confronting my fear. I thought about going back to the alley, seeing if I could rationalize what had happened, maybe even find an explanation for the whole thing. But the thought of stepping into that dark, narrow passage again made my stomach churn. The thought of seeing that figure, that thing, lurking there, waiting for me. It was too much. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Every time I approached the area, I felt the air grow heavy, thick with something I couldn't describe. And the worst part was that I knew, deep down, that I wasn't the only one who felt it. Even as I tried to push the memory away, the unease lingered. The locals who had brushed off the story with a laugh weren't laughing anymore. It was as if the whole town knew something that they weren't telling me. People's eyes would shift when I mentioned the alley. They'd glance away, or they'd change the subject. Even those who had never been near it seemed to know enough to avoid it. It wasn't just me. Something about that alley was different. Something about the butcher's legacy still held power over the place, and no one wanted to tempt fate by talking too much about it. The more I tried to distance myself from the story, the more I realized how deeply it had taken root in me. I couldn't stop thinking about the warning, about the possibility that something was still out there. And even though I told myself it was nothing more than fear, nothing more than a haunted memory, I couldn't shake the dread that settled over me every time the moon rose high in the sky. One night, several weeks after my encounter, I found myself standing at the edge of the alley again. I hadn't meant to be there. I was just walking home, distracted, when I realized that I had wandered too close. The chill in the air seemed colder this time, sharper. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The streetlights flickered, casting long, trembling shadows that stretched unnaturally far across the ground. For a moment, I hesitated, staring down the narrow passageway. My heart thudded in my chest. I told myself to turn around, to walk away, but my feet were rooted to the spot. It was strange how an alley could hold so much power over you. It wasn't particularly long or wide, but it felt like an abyss. It felt like stepping into another world, one that I didn't want to explore. The pavement was slick with moisture, and the smell of decay seemed to hang in the air, faint but unmistakable. I didn't dare look too deeply into the shadows. The memory of that figure, of the gleaming hook, flashed through my mind once more, and I quickly tore my gaze away. I couldn't do it. I couldn't go back. I turned on my heel and walked away, my heart pounding with every step. The whole time, I kept telling myself that I was being ridiculous, that it was just a shadow of my fear chasing me. But the truth was, I couldn't deny it anymore. There was something about that alley, something about the meat hook killer that was beyond logic. It wasn't a ghost story, a tale spun to frighten children or amuse drunk locals. It was real. The terror I had felt, the way the figure had moved, the screech of that hook. It wasn't something I could forget. Days turned into weeks, and still, the unease never quite left. I couldn't stop thinking about the old man's warning, never walk alone after midnight. The words echoed in my mind like a chant, a mantra that kept me on edge every time I went out at night. It wasn't just the alley that haunted me now. It was the knowledge that there were things in this world, things that couldn't be explained, things that defied reason and logic. And no matter how much I wanted to forget, no matter how much I wanted to dismiss the story of the meat hook killer as nothing more than a local legend, I couldn't escape the feeling that I had barely scratched the surface of something far darker than I had imagined. The fear wasn't just in the alley anymore. It had seeped into the very fabric of the neighborhood. People walked a little faster, talked a little quieter, as though everyone knew that something was out there waiting for the right moment to strike. And it wasn't just me. It was in the way people avoided the alley, the way they spoke of it in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. It was in the way the old man had looked at me, like he knew something I didn't, something terrifying that was better left unsaid. If you ever find yourself near Queens at night, I beg you, stay far away from the butcher's alley. Don't let your curiosity get the best of you. It's not worth it. You don't want to meet the meat hook killer. You don't want to know what he is or what he's become. And remember, never walk alone after midnight. Trust me, there are some things in this world that you can't outrun. There are some things that will never let you go once they've marked you. And that alley, that butcher, they've marked me. And no matter how far I run, I know it's not over. It never will be.